Nadia Yaqub is professor of Arabic language and culture at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research has examined Arab medieval literature and contemporary oral poetry, as well as modern prose fiction and visual culture. I talked to her about three of her books: Bad Girls of the Arab World, which is about women and transgression in the Arab world; Palestinian Cinema in the Days of Revolution, which is an incredible study of Palestinian resistance through the lens of third cinema; and her most recent edited anthology, Gaza on Screen. I learned a lot in this conversation about humility, opacity, and the limits of solidarity across distances and across gaps in exposure to vulnerability and violence. Yaqub is a person with a deep understanding of the politics of the so-called humanitarian image, which is something she's very conflicted about in her work. She asks whether humanitarian images of Palestinian suffering are, quote, always depoliticizing or victimizing, or whether the depoliticization occurs through the inherently ideological frameworks in which such images circulate. I asked as my first question to Nadia what that idea of the framework means in the current moment, where Palestinians are limited in using artistic practices to demand freedom. I think a lot of us are wondering about the political forces that exist around the overwhelmingly terrifying images that we're receiving of the total war being waged on Palestine's civilian population and infrastructure. Nadia's insights here are really helpful. There's this idea in her work that the visual practices of Palestinians make up what she calls an image archive of steadfastness. Steadfastness is a core value in Palestinian culture. Yaqub is picking it up in a unique way, though, to say that, especially in terms of art and storytelling, steadfastness is about trying to sustain a sense of community. There's power in this idea for thinking about the role that communication plays in providing the conditions for political sympathy with Palestinian liberation. I don't want to necessarily belabor this introduction, so please enjoy this wide-ranging, historically detailed interview with Nadia Yaqub. I'll say that the first question is obviously, it's hard not to start with the biggest questions when it comes to what you've written about. Much of what you've written in your work on how Palestinians use artistic practices and visual culture to demand freedom, justice, and return focuses on the political forces that exist kind of around the image and that govern how it can sort of be seen and interpreted. This is a moment where almost 4 months into Israel's wanton destruction of Gaza, where the regime has dropped more bombs than were dropped on Dresden during the Second World War. It's unlike virtually any campaign of military aggression in history, you could say. And so I obviously want to just sort of welcome you to this podcast and not overwhelm you at the start, but it's difficult not to begin with this stark fact that Israel is committing genocide in Palestine. When you see a global movement trying to stand up and stand in the way of the terror, but see that terror continue, how do you kind of keep going, I guess? And how do you try to maintain some sense of hope that images, radical media, storytelling can still convince the world that the Palestinian cause is just?
Well, I think, I was at an event organized by Arab Students Organization last week at UNC, and one of the speakers talked about hope. And I think what she said was really correct and really insightful, which is that hope is not something you have, it's something you build. And so, uh, if you look at human history, it's pretty miserable. Usually, the powerful win, and the dispossessed do not. Um, and it's very, very rare that there are stories that are in any sustainable way positive, or narratives, outcomes. Um, but it's not, but that's not monolithic. It's not always that way. Um, you could also make the argument that if you don't struggle for justice, that things would be even worse. That, even if you come to the conclusion that the status quo is the best that you can have, um, that doesn't mean you give up because, like, we know it could always get worse. This is perhaps too dark, but I think, uh, and then the other thing I would say is that, the vast majority of us just have to have a lot of humility. And what I mean by that is, there's been a lot of scholarship and other kinds of writing and speech around, the failure of images. I mean, you go back to Susan Sontag, right? And regarding the pain of others. Um, and and there's a way in which, you expect a photograph or a film or a speech or an artwork to somehow so perfectly encapsulate the situation and be so convincing to every single audience that it's going to change the world. And obviously that's not going to happen. And it's true for any one individual and the multiple images and speech acts and other kinds of acts that they may perform. That you know I'm a faculty member at a university. I teach students, I organize events, I write mostly academic prose that is, relatively small audience books. Um, and I'm not going to change the world, but I have a tiny impact. I have students who've gone out and done, various good and bad things in the world. And so, and, also through just my casual networks and friendships and conversations I have with people I meet, on the bus or that I walk with regularly, all of those things have their small, small impacts. Um, and if you think about them, if you do them, if you go out in the world and participate, you do have you do something good, um, even if you're not going to change the world. And you just have to hope that you can help to grow the number of people that are doing good things, and that will, at the very least, keep things from getting worse,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
slow down the pace at which they get worse.
Yeah.
There's always climate change looming in the background. Um, but and perhaps we'll make some positive differences here and there.
Hmm. Yeah, I think like this is there's a lot of different ways that we can kind of go with that, like really incredibly generous response. Like I've been thinking a ton about the role that communication plays in
Yeah.
providing the grounds for basically like greater political sympathy toward, in this case, Palestinian liberation, and how like what little control I have over representation can help expand
Mhm.
people's awareness of,
Yeah.
you know, the justness of the Palestinian cause. But yeah, and climate is something that I certainly focus on a lot in the podcast, and feel so often like something that's too late and there's too little we can do about it. But if we if we like acquiesce to this apocalyptic stuff that is
Yeah.
coming in the future, obviously, that's just not it's not tenable. Like that option, and the problem seems to be, though, like one of the chronic issues, especially but not exclusively within Israel, is that control of media representation. Gideon Levy told me recently that there's like a highly controlled media apparatus
Right, right.
in Israel that's like complicit, basically, with the Zionist regime's colonial ambitions, um, and the occupation. It's he said basically it's working to exonerate Israel and Israelis.
Sure.
You
Yeah,
know, um, and in your edited anthology, Gaza on Screen, there's this really brilliant essay by Rebecca Stein, right, where she
right.
says, Israel's strategies are terrifyingly effective.
Mhm.
Like that said, I think you and Stein both kind of see the emergence of new media technologies and just more solidarity as allowing a certain kind of awakening, you know? Um, that does not seem to be the case necessarily in Israel. The annihilationist intent of Netanyahu's far right government has a lot of support. But like if you're looking at social movements globally, the injustice, the asymmetry
Right,
of the
right.
situation is clear. Rather than rendering Palestinians legitimate targets, right? That's how Stein puts it. Do you think the dominant frame has shifted more towards sympathy for the occupied in this moment?
It's hard for me to say. Um, I I wrote in Palestinian Cinema in the Days of Revolution about uh, Tel Azatar and the massacre of Tel Azatar, which followed closely on the heels of two other massacres in, the massacre in Damour of, the Christian town of Damour, and before that in Karantina, of a poor, mostly Muslim neighborhood in East Beirut. And sorry, did I say Damour on the western side? So, and those horrific acts of violence, but especially Talazatar, because of this, 52-day siege, um, and just the brutality of that, um, that that felt like a turning. I was only like 17 years old, but that felt like a huge thing. Um, then in 1982, my parents were still living in Beirut during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And that invasion seemed unprecedented in the horrific violence that Israel inflicted on the Palestinians and Lebanese. And they occupied, they came up to an Arab capital. They had never done that before. And there were all these journalists who were in Lebanon, Western journalists, because they existed back in those days in large numbers. And, Beirut was a hub for many of them that covered the region. So it was really well covered. And it was horrifying. Like, how could they have the audacity to inflict this kind of violence? And that felt like a turning point in terms of violence. And then you had the Second Intifada and, this policy of breaking bones, which, like, that we will intentionally break the bones of protesters in lieu of shooting them. Like, it's better to break bones than shoot them. But that shocked. And again, there were lots and lots of journalists on the ground. This was all of, this also felt like, how can people be so brutal? And then we've got, 2008, 2009, well, the 2006 invasion of Lebanon. Again, this massive level of destruction. Every one of these just felt like, Israel has gone beyond, it's gone beyond the limits. And surely this time, the international community is going to step in. Israel's going to become a pariah state. And then we've got 2008, 2009 attack on Gaza, and 2014, 2021, and then there's the, 2012, in between that didn't even get covered. The Great March of Return was barely even covered in the media, and yet it was brutal violence. And so there's a way in which, I mean, so that's sort of another narrative, but there's a way in which I've just in my lifetime have experienced so many of these events that have felt like this has to be it. This has to be when the tide turns. I am not enough of a media scholar to be able to say that new media frameworks, and I would include not just the rise of social media and but also things like the development of satellite TV, which changed the media landscape in the Arab world, and now beyond, whereby sitting here in the U.S. Um, I can get Al Jazeera in either Arabic or English, and uh, you know, Americans can get Al Jazeera in English really easily. So that by itself, that's sort of a traditional media, but yet its scope is so different now than it used to be. I can't say how much these factors are affecting this present global moment, this moment, in comparison to previous ones. Um, my my intuition is that, um, well, first of all of these media frameworks have their limitations. And they're, I mean, you know this better than I do. Social media, it's all owned by the big tech companies, and they have their biases and they have their algorithms and ways of affecting political speech. And then there's AI and the bots and, deep fakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but beyond that, I think that, uh, and this sort of goes back to Edward Said and Orientalism, that there's an intertwining of power and information flows and representation that are sort of mutually reinforceable. And I wouldn't say that it's monolithic. I wouldn't say that, it's inevitable that the powerful will remain powerful and nobody else can ever get a word in edgewise. But that it's inevitable that we have the social media frameworks that we have, given the power structures under which they were created or through which they were created. Um, and again, you've got to struggle and struggle and struggle. In human history, power ebbs and flows for various complex reasons. Um, and whether this is a moment globally where Palestine is not the only issue that might result in a shift, I couldn't say, but perhaps it is.
Yeah.
Um, and it's and that's, I mean, I'm speaking way out of my area of
No,
expertise
but
here, but
I really appreciate it because like
yeah.
you're bringing this kind of um, you know, I think really textured like sense of the history to the contemporary moment where I don't think anyone knows. Like it's Judith Butler said on this podcast that um, you know she feels as though we are always imagining that world, and that if we weren't, there would be no way to experience outrage. There would just be complacency, right? And so I think like the history that you offer kind of reinforces that idea, and I was kind of hoping that we could shift slightly toward thinking through the like events that led us to this
Mhm.
just unbelievably dire situation, and you kind of gave us a way to do that. This book that you mentioned, Palestinian Cinema in the Days of Revolution, provides a remarkable history, and it reaches back to try and understand the ways that Palestinian cinema emerged as part of like a bigger wave of
Mhm.
decolonization movements globally. um, so I generally am just curious to hear you talk about what came out of researching that book for you, Obviously, one of the things that's really interesting about it, and you mentioned it in the book, is that um, you're sort of positioned as an outsider, so to speak. You know, writing about these movements, like you were educated in the U.S., but lived for many
Right.
years in Beirut and elsewhere in the Arab world. The way you put it is that your family history brushes up against that of the Palestinian Revolution. Um, so like, for example, you talk about how Palestinian cinema, specifically in the 1970s and onward, is really informed by so-called third world cinema movements.
Hmm.
I think that might be an interesting thing to unpack for people. Like, I don't know that that's a particularly well understood thing. You know, how I guess did revolutionary Palestinian films fit in relation to so-called, third world cinema movements, and what are some of the characteristics of that?
Okay, so the third world cinema movement arose out of the third cinema movement to some
Mm,
extent, which, there are these classic texts um, by Latin American filmmakers, activists, scholars, articulating this idea of third cinema.
mm,
And basically, what that is that cinema is this very, very powerful communication tool.
mhm,
Um, and but its ideological framework, first of all, it's mostly allied with empire, um, and every aspect of film making and viewing are informed by that alliance with empire. So the way it's funded, the way it's made, the types of stories that are told, um, and the way that it's distributed and viewed, all serve to sort of reinforce the imperial hegemonies, um, and that if one wants to do something, if one wants to fight against that, you need to create a whole new cinema infrastructure, and this has to be, it has to be like it starts with funding. So, you are just not going to have the funding. There's no way to have big budget films and have them not be ideologically compromised. You're going to rely a lot on, found footage, on, maybe 16 millimeter as opposed to 32 millimeter, your, small crews. Your film crews are all going to, like, everyone has to be able to do everything. It's going to be black and white, um, perhaps more documentary than fiction. Um, so the production, so the funding, the nature of the production, and then the way that and then the distribution, is it's not going to be through these, for-profit, theaters, but it's gonna go through revolutionary circuits, through, union halls or universities, or outdoors, or these spaces where politics happens. And the film has to be, it's got to be a gathering of people in person. Of course, in those days you couldn't imagine any, well, I guess you had television, but um, uh, it's in person, and then the film is accompanied by dialogue. So the film is not in and of itself the revolutionary product, but the film is the basis for an event at which there is discussion, education happens, and it's two ways. And then, the filmmaker learns from these events, the practice of screening the films and talking to people, and goes back and changes the film, maybe changes that actual film, or creates a new one that is a little bit different. And so it's this constant dialectic process. It's always in motion. So that was third cinema. And then, those ideas articulated by Latin American filmmakers, but also resonating what's happening elsewhere, as much of the newly decolonized world is looking to cinema as um, as an important tool uh, in a couple of different ways. One is that this idea of development is still pretty widely understood as a positive thing. That that this idea. I mean, there were already ideas expressed by Frantz Fanon and many others that, like, we don't need to become like Europe. Technology. There's not just one path, but uh, but nonetheless, there was also, very widespread idea that technological development is a positive thing. There's a kind of catching up to be done technologically. And cinema is a part of that in terms of culture, education, and so on. Um, so, in and of itself, but then also in response to the ways in which the more sort of imperialist cinema, American cinema, and in the Arab world also, French cinema, is widely circulated, spreading these values that are not necessarily friendly to the types of nations that many Arab intellectuals wanted to see being built at that time. Um, so there's that idea on the one hand of, like, this idea that cinema is important in terms of development, and then this third cinema idea of, that's a little more radical, of, cinema as, a space for uh, uh, not just developing nations, but developing particular kinds of revolutionary societies. Um, um, so, um, so third cinemas, I mean, if you look at the literature, you start to see less talk of like third cinema and more of third world cinema, and that's a bigger term. It encompasses, all these kinds of cinemas that I'm talking about. So, uh, the building of public sector cinemas in many, relatively recently independent countries around the world. So, I mean, in the Arab world, that's mainly Algeria and Syria. And well, and Egypt as well. I mean, Egypt had its big commercial cinema, but then under Nasser in the 50s, they start to develop also a public sector cinema. Um, and there were a lot of hopes invested in that project that sort of um, excuse me, was greatly curtailed when Sadat, when Nasser died and Sadat came to power.
Hmm,
Um, but so early on, because that's like 1970.
sure.
So public sector cinema is one aspect of it, and
Mhm.
then you've got the rise of some small film collectives, um, and and the Palestinian cinema that begins in the late 60s in Amman, is a part of this whole process.
Right.
Um, and um, Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just wondered
Yeah.
if you could like convey maybe like your own personal attachment to these films. Like, are there moments where you felt as a so-called kind of outsider changed by a collective screening? Because you do say like these are networked images valued more for their virality than their representational qualities, and it's interesting to use the term virality. But it's like a form of viewing that's about maintaining a sense of community in moments of crisis. Like, can you recall particular films or moments where, your political awareness, your motivation for writing, your activism, like was mobilized by like being moved by one of those moments?
So, yes. So when I first came to studying film, I'm not trained as a film scholar. I came out. My PhD is in Near Eastern Studies from UC Berkeley, and my training is largely philological. And I moved, basically from linguistics to literature, and then came to film through teaching because I started to incorporate Arab films in my Arabic literature classes as a way of, just sort of animating the classes. And, you know, there's just so much that you can communicate through, just never mind the foreground or the story, the background. The background of, what is Beirut like as a city, or Cairo or anything else. Um, and then when I started to want to write about film, I started to go to Palestinian film festivals, and for mundane reasons, began going to the London Palestine Film Festival. In the I can't remember when the first time I went, maybe 2008, 2009, something like that. Um, and by the third time I went to that annual festival, I had a community there. And one, there are Palestinian film festivals all over the place. And back, at that time, they were, there was, Australia, Houston, Belgium, London, Chicago, Boston, Toronto, and probably some others. And most of those are continuing today. Um, I, and each one, there was overlap, obviously, because they would include, whatever new films were coming out, but each one had its own flavor a little bit in how it dealt with the sort of history of Palestinian film festivals. And the London Festival had an investment in the 1970s. And the people that organized it were just really interested in that particular period of history, and always included what they could find, in the way of both Palestinian works, but also other, other works, sort of politically radical works from that time. And so I got this community, and I got this education in film of the 1970s, and this sort of culminated at the Palestine Film Festival with an event um, called "The World Is With Us." I wrote about that in the book. I think in the acknowledgments or somewhere, in 2014, where the Palestine Film Foundation, which was connected to the film festival, brought some 30 some films from the 1970s. I think 34 films, and they had screenings. There was like 3 days of screenings. They brought all kinds of people. They brought filmmakers, and a couple of key activists from that period, um, and then there was an art installation that was there for a month, in a gallery space in East London, in Shoreditch, where they had old, tube televisions from the 1970s. They had about 8 or 10 of them, just screening all these films on a loop. And uh, so I attended that, and I spent like a week just watching these films over and over again. It was very, very hot because there was like it's a small space, all these giant TVs letting off heat, and there was a heat wave going on. And of course, London, there's no air conditioning or anything. So, but anyway, uh, so that, and I still have several friends, in London that I just did a book launch there in the fall, and I feel there is a community around programming of films that I became a part of um, through that experience.
Right.
So and it was that experience. I wanted to write about Palestinian film, but I wasn't quite sure how I wanted to do it and what I wanted to do. And it was that experience in London, and in particular that last, the 2014 thing, event, that made me realize I need to know this material. I need to know this material really, really well before I can even deal with the later stuff that I
Mm,
had been studying prior to that time.
right.
Um,
Yeah, it sounds like there was a really powerful pull, and
yeah,
it does, the sense I get, that I find really compelling. So I think you also write about sort of the difference between these like large screenings and the kind of lightweight, circulation of videos on small screens. It's like it matters. Like for you, I think film is a really material thing. It's about
mhm,
like what survives. It's how people survive. You talk about how the filmmaking of Palestinians has often had to like fight not only to be seen but to be made and to be
right,
preserved.
right, right,
Like there's this gutting moment where you write that, quote, Palestinian archives are continually being erased, and resisting that erasure is a key component of Palestinian activism. Like that's
right.
not a theoretical problem, but it's a question of erasure that you are theorizing in certain
Mhm.
ways. And do you sort of ever reflect on the place of theory here? I mean, it sounds like more than anything, the motive force of wanting to study it does come from these conversations that you have with people and that connection that you
Yeah.
feel. But it's interesting to me to think about existing in relation to a cinematic movement that is itself doing a sort of theorization when it comes to fighting erasure. Do you think about sort of what your work offers to that form of resistance at all?
Um, well, I think I I feel like I'm indebted more than I am giving, honestly. Um, and so, I mean, I've just learned so much from other people's work. And I'm talking about very grounded work. I mentioned the work of those, the London Palestine Film Festival, Palestine Film Foundation, but also the work of all these people that have been, knee deep or even neck deep in all this work around Palestinian archives and just trying to save them, rebuild them, restore them, recreate them. Um, uh, so I don't know that I teach them anything. I think it's much more, that they teach me. I think what I have to offer is that, um, where I am located, I have resources. I can access other archives that are not as accessible to people who may be based in, say, Amman or Ramallah or Gaza or and I'm at a really wealthy institution where through interlibrary loan um, I can read all the journals in ways that other people can't or and so what I was able to do was to amass, you know, to look at all this material, um, bring it together. And I think I do have some skills in writing, and that's what I brought is I feel like my work is a little bit more of a reporting. I mean, there is theorization, of course, but I tend to theorize from the ground rather than from the top. And that's partly, coming out of an area studies department. Um, that's my training. I'm very well aware of that, that there are pitfalls to that approach. So it's not that I'm ignoring theory. that is produced in other contexts, uh, um, but yeah.
That's like, that's a lot, right? And I think that idea of like theorizing from the ground is about what you kind of said at the beginning of the conversation, which is like humility, a certain
Yeah.
intellectual humility is sort of embodied in your practice. Like when you say it's difficult to overestimate the commitment of these filmmakers.
Hmm.
At times they slept with their cameras in order to be ready at any minute to go out and film a new atrocity. Like what would it mean to sort of just take that as data and to say like I am pedagogically here to like explain what this means? Like there's a real humility, for example, to the filmmakers roundtable that you include in Gaza on Screen,
Hmm.
right? It's just incredible. And one of the things that comes out of that discussion, which I guess you moderated, is that it's like,
Actually, I didn't moderate. Actually,
oh
that was
no, okay,
no Azal. I brought in Azal Hassan,
oh, okay,
who's the Palestinian filmmaker. I wanted Palestinian filmmaker to moderate it, not me from the outside.
okay,
So I introduced it, and then yeah,
okay.
yeah,
That's I appreciate that,
yeah.
context. Yeah, I guess I misread that. But, it's this idea in that roundtable, the way you introduce it is about, like, a certain humility, right? That you're
Mhm,
learning from what they're saying, and what they're saying is, in part, that there's real potential in like defying expectations, refusing to focus on just the trauma of occupation. You've written quite a bit about this idea that simply depicting the beauty of life in Palestine is potentially an act of political
mhm,
refusal. This idea, as you say, that like the background, what is life like,
yeah.
in the background? Um, so I was just kind of hoping that you might be interested in talking about that idea of um, depicting the everyday as a kind of tactic of resistance, a humanizing
Mhm.
tactic, and yeah, just sort of what you maybe how that came out of that particular roundtable for you to some extent.
So I will do that. But as you were talking, an idea came
Sure.
to me that I
Yeah,
wish
yeah.
I had included in the introduction. So you are going to be the first to hear it. But this idea of theorizing from the ground.
Hmm.
Um, I talked a lot about, I mean, like the humanitarian image, the image of violence in the introduction, and the ways in which it's, like it's sort of it's very reflexively rejected as being depoliticizing. That's and several of the contributors to the book make that point, and it certainly is true that the humanitarian image, or the image of violence, the image of victimhood, all of those can definitely be dehumanizing and depoliticizing, for the people who are depicted in the images. Um, uh, at the same time, there's this phrase, show the world, uh, that has also been discussed extensively, by people who are reflecting on reporting from Palestine or filmmaking from Palestine. Like, if only the world could see, then they would act and they would change. Um, what's happening on the ground, and that also has been critiqued. And at the theoretical level here, by scholars of film and photography in the West, but also by many Palestinians, Azal Hassan in particular. Uh, and I've used her work on this a lot, um, where she makes that point, and it informs her filmmaking. But with what's been happening recently, and this takes us back to what you asked me about in terms of like the media frameworks today, and are they having an effect, or um, is it different? Is this a turning point? Um, I've been thinking about it's really less the content of the image, or even the circulation of images themselves than it is the attention economy that makes a difference. I mean, this sounds rather banal, but it's actually not. And there's a kind of theorizing from the ground, I think, from Palestinians when they say, show the world. What they're saying is, make the world pay attention. Everybody, all of you, you come here, you tell us you want to help. This is what you can do. You can make the world pay attention. And there's something really profound about that. And uh, that may be a little bit that is different today. I mean, the world is paying attention. I mean, the mainstream media is barely paying attention, um, but people are. And, the fact that we continue to have, hundreds of thousands of people coming out to demonstrations in London and big actions in Oakland and Brooklyn and all over the world. That uh, and that, I mean, I really that's the only hope that we have, is through those mass actions. And those mass actions will only happen if we pay attention. And if we insist that everybody else pay attention. Like
Right.
okay, it's not on the first page of the New York Times anymore, but
Mm.
it's still beyond what is acceptable for human beings to do to each other. And it
Yeah.
still needs to be addressed. Um,
Yeah.
and
Right.
so that's a kind of theorizing from the ground I really want to draw attention to. Um, uh, that I wish I'd written about that. Maybe I'll write about it,
I
somewhere
hope you
else.
do.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Um,
this is writing about it in a sense, right?
yeah.
Like this
Yeah.
venue is exactly about like trying to kind of
Yeah.
work with these complex problems, like work out these complex problems.
Yeah.
And I think the question of the attention economy is for me not banal. I mean, like there's a lot at stake. Um, Still, I would say in the self censorship of Israeli media, in the algorithmic censorship of Meta and Facebook, like there is a strong sense in your work that these things do matter. Like in terms of the history, even like thinking back,
Yeah.
there's these turning points that you identify that you're trying to draw attention to. You're interested in everything from like the 1950s and the formation of these kind of first militant groups in Palestine to, I think, like especially there's this concern with the first Intifada and how the uprising that eventually led to the Oslo Accords and the creation of the PLO, or Palestinian Authority, is kind of remembered. Um, and like the ultimate failure of Oslo is a key moment too. You seem to be sort of circling around to some extent this question of like armed struggle, basically as a sort of line in the sand politically. You've
Yeah.
written that the political landscape for Palestinians is as fragmented today as it was in the immediate aftermath of the 1948 war. I mean, given the impacts of October 7th, and the coordinated attack on Israel that Hamas led on that day, I feel like we have to wonder, how has that attack as a major event in the cultivation of certain attitudes or dispositions toward armed resistance sort of changed what I think you call not culture, political culture in Palestine, but yeah, what you call the ethics and efficacy of armed struggle, and how filmmakers are,
Right.
artists are existing in relation to and in the aftermath of those forms of armed resistance. Did you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah. I mean, that's I I can speak to that. I don't have answers. Um, uh, I mean, I feel as if. Well, first of all, it's not my place to say you should or shouldn't engage in armed struggle or any other, and violence. And then you like, what is violence anyway? When you've got these, um, anti-Palestinian activists who are calling like boycott a violent act, or saying anything remotely pro-Palestinian as being somehow violent speech. Um, uh, it's like, then it's like, okay, you just throw up your hands and say, okay, well, since violence is everything, yeah, we have to we'll all have to be violent. I'm sorry. But on the other hand, if you restrict violence to um, uh, uh, let's say actually, the actual use of, let's just draw the line somewhat arbitrarily with like anything that has like gunpowder in it and above. So the idea being that, I mean, a stone is not, you know, I mean, it doesn't really matter where you draw the line, um, whether you include stone throwing or not. But um, then, I mean, I don't think, for me, sitting here comfortably in the United States, to say, well, Palestinians shouldn't, use guns or grenades or Molotov cocktails, or, or even, throw stones or knives or, drones or missiles. Um, they should only use nonviolent means. Um, and then when you have this long history where every attempt at using these nonviolent means, which is the vast majority of Palestinian actions, which has included, negotiation, um, appeals to authorities, whether it's, British mandate authorities, appeals to Israeli authorities, appeal to the US, appeal to the EU, et cetera, going through the courts, whether it's, as we've seen most recently, the ICJ, the ICC, the, US federal courts. Apparently, there are also cases in other national courts. I don't know that much about them, uh, but then also going through like Israeli military courts, which was, a big nonviolent effort after the '67 war among young lawyers. The idea, Al Haq, that NGO is the main organization that did this. They said, look, okay, we are going to fight these land confiscations and administrative detentions using the law as a tool to improve Palestinian lives. And if you read Raja Shahada, his experiences, at the end of, decades of doing this work, realizing that by actually participating in this court process, we have, because of the way it was structured against us, we have actually contributed to the creation of this military law that now oppresses us. And because this whole body of law that governs the West Bank um, came into being through the military occupation and was built through occupation. So, so that's one type of nonviolent, action, totally underreported, devastating, absolutely devastating to Palestinians in terms of their very basic rights under Israeli occupation. And then you've got things like, attempting to move through human rights organizations, very careful documentation of violations, the work of B'Tselem and other organizations, and then, nonviolent demonstrations, boycotts, strikes, the Great March of Return. They've tried, and they've, it's mostly failed. And not only has it failed, not only have Palestinians not regained anything that has been lost, in the Hundred Years' War, since the establishment of the British Mandate, which is really the beginning of Palestinian dispossession. Not only that, but the encroachment of dispossession, mainly on the part of Israel, has continued. So it's like you just sit there and watch your life just slowly being seeped away from you, whether in small ways like the time you spend at a checkpoint, the all the efforts you need to make to get a work permit, the kinds of political compromises you need to make, the worry and anxiety and stress to protect your children, especially your boys, as they approach, I don't know, 5 years old now, before they can be, administratively detained. Watching, your houses, get destroyed. You just, you're just, um, you know, there's this encroachment. So it's like all you can do is disappear. You can disappear slowly. I mean, that's what happens if you don't resist. You'll just disappear slowly. Um, so who am I to say it's better for you to disappear slowly than for you to like say enough is enough.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna act out.
Hmm.
And so I feel as if a better way to think of it, it's not to think like that any of us should judge,
Hmm.
but rather let's examine the conditions and explain why certain things are inevitable,
Hmm.
including October 7th,
Hmm.
which,
Hmm.
you know, you probably know as well as I do that, like, long before October 7th, people who were paying attention were saying this is going to explode.
Yeah. I mean, the Israeli government was warned that it was going to be that the situation was escalating. I think by
Yeah.
Egypt, right?
And
Um,
I mean, it was I think there were probably editorials in the New York
sure.
Times saying that. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
remember now what I read
And
where,
yet,
but
yeah, that inevitability, that sense of,
yes.
Gideon Levy told me about this, like it
Yeah.
from his perspective in Israel, like there is just a kind of willful blindness when it comes to
Mhm.
that relationship of cause and effect, right? The violence at the Al-Aqsa
Yeah.
Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah like led to earlier escalations. The sheer number of innocent Palestinians killed is enough to provoke any form of resistance, and yet it becomes very difficult, I think, for those of us, as you say, who are existing in this kind of comfortable bubble, to like go
Mm.
to a place of actually dwelling with
Yeah.
that question of, do you disappear quickly or slowly?
Yeah.
And I think images definitely have a role to play in collapsing that distance. Um, there is certainly a sense, looking back through your work, um, that uprisings in the West Bank and Gaza can attract attention. That you can leverage mass communication to build solidarity, and I think that combined with Palestinian documentary practice is seen in your work as a potentially powerful weapon. And I think Israel understands that it is. I mean, look at the ways in which it's targeting journalists in the current
Right.
offensive.
Right.
That has to be
Yeah.
on some level an indication. But I kind of wanted to come back to like there's so much, right? But
Mhm.
something you said earlier about the humanitarian image,
Right.
which
Right.
I just think is maybe worth fleshing out. Like what I think is really powerful and kind of like dialectical in the way that you write about it is that you're saying that we might actually need to accept, as you say, the necessity or at least the inevitability of humanitarian images as long as violence and dispossession continue. But like that doesn't mean that we only read them one way, right?
Right.
You
Right.
say that we need to develop strategies for effectively viewing them. I think the way that you kind of think about witnessing politically is uniquely clear from my perspective, because you're sort of saying that we need to be critical witnesses, that we need to,
Mm.
you use this term from Edward Glissant of opacity, right? That we need to recognize actually the opacity of the images and films, the reports that we might receive. Um, I think that is a really tricky concept for people, maybe, like in terms of
Yeah.
what to trust, what not to trust. It's it feels to me like trust is what's at stake in opacity. What how, I guess the flat question, or the simple way to put it is, why is critical witnessing important when it comes to these images?
Well, I would say I'm not sure if I would call it critical witnessing, but humble witnessing. It comes back to humility. Um, the idea being, I mean, for me, I think thinking of every image as being opaque um, uh, is about recognizing the limitations of what of one's own perspective, of recognize this is not to say one can't draw conclusions about an image and what one sees in it, but that one draws those conclusions always with the awareness that somebody else might see something else that you are not going to see, just because of their different life experience, their different knowledge, their different, um, and so this is where I'm saying what I find useful about the theory of opacity. I mean, the way uh, some of the ways in which it's been used in the art world is about creating works that are really difficult to see. Like it's hard to tell what's going on. So the purpose of the work is not necessarily specifically to address any particular political or social condition, but rather to raise awareness about opacity in the viewer. So it's a kind of, they're operating on a rather abstract level, which nothing wrong with that. But it's not the level, it's not the aspect of opacity that interests me per se. What I'm more interested in is what the way opacity, as I understand Glissant, the idea that I, as a Caribbean poet or a Palestinian filmmaker or an Iraqi, visual artist or I don't know, Senegalese musician, I'm going to create this work and throw it out into the world. And, some people are going to come really, really close to understanding what I am trying to express in my work because their experience is so close to mine. They know the language, they've lived in the same places, they have come from a similar, socioeconomic background, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are other people who, for one reason or another, are going to get a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less, depending on, how far away they are. And there are all kinds of factors that can, this is not like predetermined, obviously, that, a rich white person can't understand a poor black person. I'm not saying that at all, but that there are going to be layers um, of within any kind of image or cultural expression that are going to be differently accessible to different audiences, and that's okay. And that depending on who you are, if I read the Caribbean poet or listen to the Senegalese musician, I take what I can out of it, I try, but I accept that, like, I don't know that language, so all I can really get is the rhythm and the sort of cadences, and enjoy that and have a kind of an emotional response to that, or um, or I know the language, but I don't know that, these particular, melodies or riffs are actually quotes to these other musicians, or, so, and so that is to me what, and there's a way in which if one is reading that way, as if every image or text is opaque, that one is, there, you're then communicating as equals, that, I'm opaque, you're opaque, we're trying the best to, to bridge the gap. It's never going to be 100%, um, but that's okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
and so you're not demanding transparency.
right. And that's, I feel like that is a really like helpful dismantling of what I'm projecting myself, like as a white
Right,
settler male, onto a lot of these images, which is like, if I'm a critical witness, I can get the right thing out of it. I can,
right, right,
decode it, right? And you're saying like you you don't you can't know, like there's an indeterminate nature to
right,
like that
right.
exchange.
Yeah.
You have to remain open to it.
But
um
it's worth working to approach it.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
always true too. Yeah.
for
Even if you
sure.
can't know, it's
Yeah.
worth working to approach it.
Yeah, and to, approach it with the sense that, yeah, there's no predetermined outcome without prescriptions or
Yeah.
predictions or presuppositions. Like, to try and do your best to be aware of those things. And
Yeah.
there's this, you have an article, catastrophe and post catastrophe, a chapter, I think, in an anthology, catastrophe and post catastrophe in the films of Kamal Al Jafari.
Al
And like
Jafari. Yeah.
Al
Yeah.
Jeffrey, you end that article, that piece, by just raising questions. Like, this is the kind of open-ended kind of opacity, where you kind of don't want to necessarily draw conclusions, and you say, how can one create a cinema that goes beyond the melodramatic temporality of too late, of it's over, or that avoids the false optimism of resistance after it's
Mhm.
become evident that resistance, whether violent or otherwise, will not undo the ongoing processes of what you called encroachment, theft, and erasure that underpin every settler colonial project. This, you say,
I
is very
wrote that in a very pessimistic mood.
right. And
Yeah.
actually, on that point,
Yeah.
like, I feel as though we should end with some sort of gesture to building hope, as you say, not something you have, but something you try and build. And I do think that there's an attempt in your co-edited book, Bad Girls of the Arab World, to like build toward hope on some level. Like, it is an academic book, but it's a book that was inspired by another radical feminist text, Bad Girls of Japan, published in 2005. Um, I guess my question about that book is, what's useful or empowering even for societies in which, as you say, the vast majority of women wear the hijab, and where the visibility of women's bodies in public spaces has been and continues to be hotly contested. What is
Can I
important?
just say that, women's bodies are hotly contested everywhere?
Thank you for saying it. It should be said. Yeah, of course. Like,
You
even
know,
especially where they are, like, let's say, rendered bare for commodity reasons,
right,
like,
right, and there
they're
was
so
that
hotly
case some years
contested.
ago in France where, like,
Yeah.
a woman was, like, forced to undress, like, she ca was e I can't remember what
Mm,
exactly happened, but she was either expelled from the beach because she refused to undress,
mm.
or was made to undress so that she
Oh,
could
yeah.
stay on the beach. That was several years ago. It was a big
Yeah, I remember
scandal.
that. I
Yeah,
mean, like, no matter where you look, I was talking to a friend recently about, sports culture, right?
yeah.
And the kind of asymmetries, inequalities within sport culture, where, women have to very often sort of assert a feminist ethic of the body, where like they're just, claiming ownership of it. but then two, you're like making your body like it's just you're ensnared in this kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
patriarchal
Yeah.
nexus. Feels like no matter what you do, but you are interested, you say in that text, in transgression
Yeah.
rather than agency, which you say allows us to focus on gendered dynamics in the contemporary Arab world, which is where you're looking, within the complex limits and possibilities offered by personal, historical, and social contexts. So, yeah, I mean, like that idea of transgression, of being bad,
Mhm.
is interesting in terms of trying to kind of complicate the picture of women's embodied experiences within Arabic cultures. So, I guess, did that evolve out of just this kind of feminist decolonial practice? What are the kind of key examples that you're thinking through? And also, I guess, how are you thinking with Said in sort of a feminist way to unpack and undo some of those like simplistic understandings of what it means to be a bad girl in the Arab world?
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't actually thought about it in relation to Edward Said. So,
Well, you
so
say
that.
like Orientalist understandings of gender in the
Oh,
Arab
okay,
Islamic
okay,
world,
there,
situate
okay,
the
there.
opera,
Yeah,
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 all
yeah.
that.
Right,
That's
right,
where I
right.
kind
But
of saw
that's
the Said coming out.
right. But that's. I guess that is more. I mean, yeah. So, well, uh, what was I going? Okay, so, that book actually arose out of my friendship with my very good friend who passed away very suddenly and untimely just 3 weeks before the book came out. Rula Kouwas, my co-editor.
Sorry to hear that.
And we became friends in 2005 when she was a visiting scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, and then so I got to know her here, and then went to Jordan, and we became really, really good friends. We collaborated on a number of projects, and it was really um, just through that friendship of coming to an understanding of what her life was like as a scholar, woman scholar teacher, living in the Jordanian context, and watching her navigate uh, the that context so that she could continue to do her work, and in particular her teaching. She was an incredibly devoted and generous teacher, and mainly taught Jordanian women. They were the ones that were attracted to her classes, um, and really, really, really cared about them as as women and people, not just as students. And to so that's where the idea of the book came from, is that. And so the idea is not to focus on, okay, here are these limits placed on women, and these women are like purposely deciding they're going to go beyond the limits for this reason or that reason or whatever, but rather the ways in which, like, the limits are not always clear, and they change from time to time, because um the limits are there for particular reasons, and those particular reasons are going to need the limits to be in different places depending on how things are developing or changing, external forces, internal forces, and so on. And so it's really hard. And so trying to give a nuanced understanding of what it means to have these shifting transgression, this line shift, and to live your life such that you can be yourself, whatever that means, that you can do the work that you think is important, um, and live a life, uh, and at the same time navigate this limit, making decisions about when is it okay to go a little bit over or when not. When do you find yourself, you're just chugging along doing the same thing, and all of a sudden the line has moved and you're over the line when you weren't before. It's like looking at the work and artwork and just lived experience of women in various contexts through that lens.
Yeah,
Uh,
and you do talk about sort of how transgression will kind of almost constitute the line. Like it's transgression
mhm.
almost that kind of produces it,
Right,
and can
right.
also push the line back, right? Because
Yeah, right.
these regimes kind of feel threatened.
Yeah,
And I think, that question of the limits is certainly related to something you said earlier about the Tel Zatar siege and the sort of just the audacity of that and the sense that this must breach the limits of
right,
what is
right,
considered acceptable in terms of like transgressive, illegal violence, right? Military
right.
aggression. Um, so,
Which, by the way, the siege was not, it was, I just want to make it clear, like that siege was done by the, right-wing Lebanese
right.
militias, not by Israel,
No.
although they did have some support even in that early time. But
Okay.
yeah, just to
Thank you
just
for No, I appreciate
yeah,
you
yeah,
clarifying, like,
yeah,
it is interesting too because, like, one of the things I was gonna ask about was just, like, the ways in which, there's this sort of discourse that the situation is too complicated to understand,
yeah,
and sometimes it feels like that is a way that people sort of apologize for not taking a position, right? Like, it's too
yeah.
complicated. Do you encounter that sense of like, I can't weigh in because it's too complicated? And are you trying to kind of militate against that in your attempt to sort of, yeah, provide the coordinates historically, politically for people?
Well, I mean, of course, it's complicated because we're talking about 100 years of history.
Right.
If we're going back to Israel Palestine now,
Sure.
rather than bad girls of the Arab world, which is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. But So 100 years of any history are going to be really, really
Mm,
complicated.
mhm,
Um, but I think that there is a way of understanding that history that is um, that is not that that allows one to understand its trajectory
mhm,
and even most of the little complications um, uh, pretty straightforwardly.
mhm,
And that really is about, looking at it through the lens of power. And so that's, the colonial powers, mainly the British and the French, also, of course, the Italians and the Belgians and, everybody else who had colonies. But, at least, in the Middle East and North Africa, the British and the French, um, in the early period, and then, the US interests, and, for a time, Soviet interests. Um, I, um, and So the fact of the matter that these powerful actors wanted certain political formations to take place and did what they could to ensure certain political formations and to foreclose other ones,
mhm.
um, is what has shaped and continues to shape what's going on.
Right. Yeah.
And so once you look at it that way, then it kind of falls into place.
Yeah,
Um,
and then you can kind of start to name it,
yeah,
confidently, clearly.
yeah,
Again, like Levy talks about how in his journalism, like he doesn't like using the term fascism, but he sees fascism and he names it, right? There was a time where it wasn't, he says it wasn't accurate to call what Israel is doing apartheid. It is accurate currently, right? Like,
mhm,
so just marking it, understanding it, and the thing that you also like, maybe this is the last question I'll ask because you've been so generous with your time. I appreciate it. You name the or reinforce the naming of Palestinian steadfastness, right? This is
mhm,
a core value and a kind of political rallying cry that's
yeah,
existed within Palestine since at least like the 6 Day War in 1967. and you say, like, the artistic practices of Palestinians constitute an image archive of steadfastness.
Yeah.
Are you, I mean, where's your heart at in terms of, the idea of this powerful force being potentially under threat right now, but the overwhelming displacement, basically virtually all of Gaza,
Right.
evacuated, and just the vengefulness and the cruelty of what Israel is doing. Do you worry about the 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 protection of that value of steadfastness, which you say operates like water flowing through the cracks and ideological walls of settler colonialism? Yeah, I don't know how else to put it other than, are you worried about that steadfastness, as it were, drying up?
Well, I mean, I think we see the power of that image archive of steadfastness today
Mm-hmm.
in the mass support for Palestinians around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this really kind of takes us back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is like, I mean, I think you're sort of asking me, like, is there hope?
More or less.
And so I say again, we have to build it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's evidence that all, like the work that has been done by Palestinians, with Palestinians, and even the work done for Palestinians, and that, that's a kind of a right, like you shouldn't do things for people in struggle, you should struggle with them. But even some of the work that's been done for Palestinians has contributed to this huge archive, which people are mobilizing in all the ways that they can. Will it work? I don't know. But can we afford to just not do it because it might not work, or it probably won't work? Absolutely not.
Agreed.
So, yeah,
Thanks so much, Nadia.
you're welcome.